The city of Uruk rose from the desert like a monument to defiance. Its towering walls, carved with divine inscriptions, shimmered in the sun as if even the gods had touched the stone. Merchants shouted beneath clay-colored awnings, children darted through alleys with fig-stained hands, and priests swept incense through the temple of Ishtar, filling the air with the scent of myrrh and dried petals. At the heart of this brilliance, atop his throne of obsidian and cedar, sat Gilgamesh, 2/3 god, 1/3 man, ruler of Uruk. And he was restless. He ruled with the strength of a storm and the beauty of a desert flame. His eyes held the weight of galaxies, his shoulders the power to crumble mountains. No man dared oppose him, and no woman could resist him, not even the high-born daughters of the nobles nor the temple priestesses of Ishtar. He walked through his city like a lion among sheep, both revered and feared. Yet even as he basked in luxury, drank wine from silver goblets, and crushed warriors in ritual combat, Gilgamesh felt a gnawing emptiness inside him. Not even the praises of poets nor the wails of those he conquered filled the silence behind his eyes. There was no name for the thing that haunted him. Not yet. The night without sleep. That evening, Gilgamesh retired not to his harem, but to the roof of the palace high above Uruk. The wind played with his robes as he stared into the night sky. Stars blinked silently above him, scattered like the bones of ancient gods. He clutched his lion-skin cloak tighter, not against the cold, but against a strange sense of distance. A feeling that the stars watched him but did not see him. Below, the city slept. But Gilgamesh did not. His heart thudded like a war drum, restless, relentless. "What is wrong with me?" he whispered into the darkness. He had everything: glory, strength, immortality of name. But his soul paced like a wolf in a cage. He had crushed kingdoms. He had defied the priests of Eridu. He had fought demons in the cedar forest in his youth and returned with bloodied hands and a crown of victory. But now his dreams were strange. He had seen a falling star crash beside him, a great axe rising from the dust, and he had embraced it like a brother. He had seen the river run backwards. He had seen his own face split in two, one weeping, one laughing. And in every dream, there was a voice calling from beyond the edge of the world. Soft but insistent. A tyrant in golden chains. In the city his people whispered. The elders gathered in the temple courtyard with grave concern. "Have you seen the king?" asked one, an old man whose hands shook from age. "He has grown darker," said another. "He takes more than ever, sons from their families, daughters from their betrothed. He wrestles with spirits unseen," murmured the priest of Anu. "Even his steps are heavier." They feared him, but they also pitied him. What was a god-king if not a man with no equal? No rival, no friend, no love? "He must be given balance," said the high priestess of Ishtar. "The gods do not love an untempered blade." The curse of power. Gilgamesh's days became more erratic. He ordered slaves to build a new ziggurat, taller than the temple of Enlil. He rewrote laws in the span of an hour. He broke a warrior's neck during a sparring match, not out of anger but out of boredom. One afternoon he stood at the gates of Uruk, looking beyond the horizon toward the forests. His generals stood behind him, uncertain. "Do you see it?" he asked. "See what, my lord?" they replied. "The world. It stretches. It calls." "Perhaps you should rest," one dared to suggest. Gilgamesh turned his head slowly, his golden circlet glinting in the sun. The general stepped back, eyes lowered. Gilgamesh said nothing. But his fingers twitched. The council of the gods. Far above, in realms beyond mortal understanding, the gods convened. The god Anu, seated on his throne of stars, spoke gravely. "Gilgamesh, our child of storm and fire, grows out of balance. He is 2/3 divine," said Ishtar, "but the third that is man cries out." "Shall we destroy him?" asked Enlil, lord of wind. "No," Anu said. "He is a king. But he lacks the balance of suffering." "He must know love," Ishtar whispered. "And loss." "Then we shall send him a reflection," said He, god of wisdom. "Not an enemy but an equal." And so they formed a being out of clay, earth, and starlight. A wild man, born of the forest and the silence between animal and god. They named him Enkidu. A storm approaches. Back in Uruk, Gilgamesh stood atop the city walls as a sandstorm gathered in the distance. He did not blink. He welcomed it. For the first time in years his pulse quickened. The wind whispered through the reeds as if the world itself had taken a breath. In the vast wilderness beyond the city of Uruk, far past the cultivated lands and stone roads, a figure stirred beneath the sky. From the damp clay of the earth, limbs emerged, strong, knotted, primal. Skin like sun-baked soil. Eyes like coals hidden in the ashes of a fire. The gods had breathed life into Enkidu. He rose not as a child but as a man, towering, broad-shouldered, thick-haired, and covered in dust. Around him, the beasts of the field paused, ears perked and tails still. A lion blinked from a patch of tall grass but did not growl. A gazelle stepped cautiously toward him, then lay down beside him. Birds circled above, then descended to the branches nearby as if they too accepted him. He was wild, untamed, sacred. The wilderness had a new son. The man who walked with beasts. Days passed, though Enkidu did not measure time. He ran with the gazelles, drank from the rivers and rolled in the dust under the moon. He wrestled with bears and slept in caves. He knew no language, only instinct. He feared nothing. The wolves were his kin, the deer his companions, and in his silence he was at peace. But the gods had not formed him for peace alone. In the heavens, Ishtar looked down upon Enkidu and smiled, not with kindness but with certainty. "He is the echo," she said, "the one to draw Gilgamesh out of his own shadow." Rumors in Uruk. Back in Uruk, a shepherd boy burst into the market square, out of breath and wide-eyed. "There's a man in the forest," he shouted. "He runs with the animals. Naked and huge." The crowd laughed at first, until others too began to speak. A hunter had seen hoof prints interrupted by something bigger. A merchant swore he had heard a roar unlike any lion's echo. Children spoke of a ghost in the trees. The tales reached the ears of the high priestess of Ishtar, who narrowed her eyes and sent for the king. But Gilgamesh did not come. He was busy pacing the temple courtyard, whispering to himself about stars, storms, and falling axes. So the priestess sent someone else. The mission of seduction. Her name was Shamhat. A temple priestess trained in the sacred arts, revered and feared. She wore veils like silk clouds and perfume of spikenard and rosewood. She walked with the grace of a leopard and the patience of time itself. The priestess summoned her to the temple and said, "There is a man in the wilderness, formed by the gods. He must be tamed, civilized, drawn from the forest." "Why me?" Shamhat asked softly. "Because only through intimacy may the beast find his soul. He was made to mirror Gilgamesh. But first he must become man." And so Shamhat took food, wine, and her knowledge of the divine body and left the city, alone. The meeting. Enkidu watched from the tall grass, crouched like a wolf. He had never seen a creature like her. She did not walk like prey. She stood tall and fearless, spreading cloth upon the ground near the stream, her back to him. A basket of dates beside her. A jar of red wine. She sang softly. A hymn to Ishtar. He stepped forward, the grass rustling. Her voice did not falter. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. For the first time in his life, Enkidu froze. Not from fear but from curiosity. From something he could not name. She smiled. And the world changed. The fall into humanity. Shamhat extended her hand. Enkidu did not understand the gesture, but his body did. He approached cautiously, sniffed her fingers, then touched them. She guided him to sit beside her, offered him dates, wine, and her presence. Over 6 days and 7 nights, they lay together beneath the reeds. In that time, Enkidu changed. The animals no longer came to him. The gazelles scattered when he approached. The birds took flight. He looked into the stream and saw a different face. He began to speak, first in fragments, then in full words. His breath slowed. His mind opened. And his heart, once a silent drum, began to beat with questions. The dream. That night Enkidu dreamed. He stood at the gates of a great city, stone walls rising before him like mountains. Inside, a shadow loomed, a man cloaked in fire and thunder. Gilgamesh. But behind the king stood something greater, a dark path winding into a skyless valley. And at the edge of that void a voice whispered, "Walk with him, and you shall find your fate." He awoke sweating. Shamhat was watching him. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked. Enkidu nodded. "He burns. You are meant for him. The journey begins." Shamhat led him to the edge of the forest, where sandals waited and clothes of linen. Enkidu donned them reluctantly. He turned back once, looking into the trees, then faced forward. "Will I ever return?" he asked. Shamhat didn't answer. She took his hand and began the journey to Uruk. Far ahead, in the city of kings, Gilgamesh stood at his window, his hand pressed to his chest. He didn't know why, but his heart stirred for the first time in years. The gates of Uruk stood like a challenge to the stars, carved with symbols so ancient that even the priests no longer knew their meaning. By torchlight and moon's glow, Guards patrolled the outer walls, their eyes scanning the desert horizon. It was just past midnight when a figure approached from the shadows, walking with calm certainty. Enkidu had arrived. He wore simple linen robes now, but nothing could hide the wildness in him. The way he moved with the grace of a panther, the storm in his eyes, or the silence that followed him like a second skin. Shamhat walked beside him, her head high, but even she could feel it. The city itself reacted to his presence. Dogs barked in the distance. Candles flickered behind temple windows. Somewhere a child began to cry. The city stirs. By morning word had spread. A stranger had entered Uruk unlike any other. "He is not one of us," whispered a merchant watching from his stall. "Not quite man, not quite God," murmured a priest. "He walks like thunder," said a guard, rubbing his bruised shoulder from a friendly pat that nearly broke his arm. In the palace Gilgamesh did not yet know. But he dreamed. The dream of stars. That night, Gilgamesh tossed in his sleep, tangled in lion-skin sheets. Sweat clung to his brow as visions surged behind his eyes. He stood in the center of the city. The moon was black. Suddenly, a bright star fell from the sky and struck the ground beside him. It did not burn or break, it stood upright, solid, proud. Gilgamesh tried to lift it but it would not move. Then he embraced it like a brother. He awoke with a start, chest heaving. His chamber was dark, save for a single flame flickering in the brazier. "What does it mean?" he whispered. The dream was not the first, nor would it be the last. The crowd gathers. Outside the temple of Anu, Enkidu stood before the people of Uruk. Children peeked from behind their mothers. Warriors crossed their arms. Scholars watched with narrowed eyes. Some feared him. Others admired. But all waited. "What do you see?" Shamhat asked him quietly. Enkidu looked up at the ziggurat, then at the great columns etched with names of kings long dead. "I see a cage," he said. "Beautiful. But a cage." A voice rose above the crowd, "Let him speak with the king." Cheers followed. And so messengers were sent to the palace. The king descends. Gilgamesh descended the palace steps like a lion from its den. Gold gleamed on his wrists and obsidian lined his sword's hilt. His eyes scanned the crowd, and stopped when they met Enkidu's. For a long moment the world went still. Two forces. Two storms. Two echoes of divinity. Neither bowed. Gilgamesh stepped forward. "You stand boldly in my city," he said, voice low and sharp. "Who are you?" Enkidu's response was simple, "Your equal." The crowd gasped. The battle. Without warning Gilgamesh lunged, fast as lightning, his blade drawn. Enkidu met him halfway, bare hands catching the blade's swing. Metal rang like thunder. Dust swirled around them as they moved, titans locked in a dance of fury. They crashed into stone columns, shattered a merchant's cart, rolled through flower gardens and fountains. Torches were knocked over. The people screamed, but none fled. They watched. Hours passed, or perhaps only moments. The battle was not just of strength but of will. Neither man gave way. Until finally, breathing hard, Gilgamesh was pinned beneath Enkidu's forearm, his sword just out of reach. Enkidu did not strike. He stood and offered Gilgamesh his hand. And for the first time in his life the king took it. Brothers born of struggle. Gilgamesh laughed. A deep, roaring laugh that echoed through the palace courtyard. "You are no man," he said, grinning. "You are a storm wrapped in skin." "And you," said Enkidu, "are not as alone as you thought." The people stared in disbelief as the king clapped the wild man's back and called for wine. That night the fires burned high and the city rejoiced. But in the sky the moon drifted behind a cloud. And in the heavens the gods watched, silent, knowing this union would shift the fate of nations. The wine had long grown warm in their cups, but the fire still crackled between them. Gilgamesh and Enkidu sat upon a stone terrace overlooking Uruk. The city lay hushed under the stars, bathed in moonlight and whispers. Far below, servants gathered goblets and scattered petals, but neither man moved. Gilgamesh stared beyond the city walls, past the desert, past the night itself. "There is a silence inside me again," he said at last. Enkidu turned his gaze toward him, calm but alert. "Even now?" Gilgamesh nodded slowly. "The people love me. The city breathes my name. But when I die, what remains? A stone statue? A name carved in dust? Legacy," Enkidu said. "Legacy fades. I want eternity. The forbidden forest." Gilgamesh leaned closer, his voice low as if the darkness might overhear him. "There is a forest," he said, "far to the west. The gods planted it themselves, a paradise of ancient trees, fragrant and tall as mountains. Enkidu froze. I know it, he said. The cedar forest. It is not for us. Gilgamesh's eyes gleamed like firelight. Then it is exactly where we must go. Enkidu stood abruptly. You don't understand. That place is guarded. A monster dwells there. A creature born of fire and storm, Humbaba. He was given that forest by the gods themselves. I do not fear monsters, said Gilgamesh. You should, Enkidu replied. Night visions. That night, Gilgamesh slept uneasily. The dream returned, this time deeper, sharper. He stood before a mountain of cedar, its branches weeping golden sap. He stepped forward and the ground trembled. From the forest came a voice, not words but something ancient and vast. A wind that roared like prophecy. He turned, and Enkidu stood beside him. But blood dripped from his friend's hands. And behind them, the shadow of a great beast rose taller than the stars. He awoke gasping. The moon was low. The sky veiled in clouds. Somewhere a wolf howled. Council of opposition. In the morning, Gilgamesh summoned his council of elders. Gray-bearded men in robes lined with gold, each one hardened by decades of war and drought and rebuilding. I seek the cedar forest, Gilgamesh announced. Silence. One elder finally spoke. That place is cursed. It is sacred. Even we do not speak of it. Another said, the forest is guarded by Humbaba, a creature from before time. Gilgamesh rose to his full height. I do not fear him. I seek glory, true divine glory. Not walls. Not markets. I want to etch my name on the edge of the world. Then you are not seeking glory, said a third. You are chasing your death. The bond of brothers. That night, Enkidu sat alone in the temple gardens. The moon cast long shadows between the date palms. He had not slept. He had not prayed. He only remembered. Long ago, before speech, before Shamhat, he had stood at the edge of the forest. The trees had hummed. The air smelled of blood and honey. And in the mist, he had heard the breath of Humbaba. He closed his eyes and saw fangs the length of spears. Eyes like burning stones. He did not fear many things. But he feared that. A hand rested on his shoulder. It was Gilgamesh. If you won't come, the king said, I will go alone. And that broke something inside Enkidu. You won't go alone, he said. Under the watch of the gods. In the heavens the gods leaned close. Look, said Ishtar. They prepare for battle. Humbaba will not fall easily, said Enlil. He was made to protect. Then let them face him, Anu whispered. Let them chase their names into eternity. Departure. At midnight, Gilgamesh and Enkidu left Uruk. No procession. No music. Only stars and torchlight. Gilgamesh wore his lion-skin cloak. His sword glimmered at his hip. Enkidu carried no blade, only a staff carved from oak. They passed the sleeping city in silence. They walked west, toward a forest where gods whispered and monsters breathed, toward glory or ruin. Part 1. The Departure. The wind shifted that night. Over the walls of Uruk, the moon hung low, silver and sullen, as Gilgamesh stood before the eastern gate, his cloak rippling in the warm wind. Behind him, the city lay asleep, unaware that their king, whose blood bore both man and god, was about to tempt fate. Beside him, Enkidu adjusted the leather strap of his axe, eyes narrow and silent. He did not like the omens. The ravens flew low and the stars were restless. Constellations seemed to shimmer out of place. Still you go? He asked. Gilgamesh didn't look at him. The forest calls. Glory is not found in the safety of city walls. And what of Humbaba? Enkidu's voice lowered. That thing was not born of flesh nor fate. Even the gods tread lightly where he walks. Gilgamesh smiled faintly, brushing dust from his bronze blade. Then let the gods watch us. They walked east, past the gardens, the fields and the temples, into the land where no light dwelled but that of the stars. No crowd cheered them, no priest blessed them. Only the silence of the sleeping world and the whisper of destiny at their backs. Part 2. Visions beneath the moon. On the third night they made camp at the edge of the plains. The cedar forest loomed still days away, yet its scent drifted faintly on the wind, rich, sap-sweet, and ancient. Gilgamesh sat beside the fire sharpening his sword, humming a song of old kings. Enkidu, curled in the shadows, stared up at the sky, troubled. The gods send dreams when they grow uneasy, he murmured. And I have dreamed. Gilgamesh stopped sharpening. Tell me. In my dream I walked a field of ash. From the sky fell a mountain, flaming and endless. I could not move. Then a voice said, "The forest remembers every step. The guardian forgets none." Gilgamesh was quiet. Then he chuckled. "Dreams are wind. Humbaba is flesh. He can bleed." But Enkidu didn't laugh. "He is not flesh, Gilgamesh. Not as we know it." The fire crackled between them. Beyond, the wilderness stirred. Trees whispered without wind. Owls held their calls. Far off, something roared. Part 3, The Forest Approaches. By the sixth night, the grassland had given way to hills and rocky veins. The trees had changed. Thicker. Older. Their trunks were wide as towers, their leaves strange, gleaming under moonlight like polished stone. And ahead, the edge of the cedar forest. It rose like a wall of shadows, the trees rising into the clouds, their limbs gnarled, interwoven, impossibly ancient. A smell of resin and decay hung heavy in the air. "Do you feel that?" Gilgamesh whispered. "The air, it listens." Enkidu did not reply. His skin prickled. His breathing slowed. "I was born not far from here," he said at last. "The beasts once warned me, this forest eats memory. What enters may not leave whole." Gilgamesh stepped forward, placing a hand on the bark of the first cedar. The surface pulsed faintly, warm. Alive. "Then let it try," he whispered. Together they stepped into the dark. Part 4, Shadows Without Sound. Within the forest the world changed. Moonlight barely pierced the canopy. Strange bird calls echoed above, and the ground seemed to hum beneath their boots. No path lay ahead, yet their feet knew the way, as if something pulled them deeper. For hours, or perhaps days, they could no longer tell, they walked among trees that whispered names they had never spoken. Dreams pressed against their eyes even while waking. Ghosts of voices long lost flickered in the corners of their vision. Enkidu fell to his knees beside a black pool. "This place is cursed." Gilgamesh touched his shoulder. "No, not cursed. Guarded." A sound came then, low and rumbling. Not from ahead. From everywhere. A voice like stone grinding against stone. "Who walks in the breath of the gods?" The air went still. Even the leaves held their breath. Enkidu's face drained of color. "He watches us." But Gilgamesh stepped forward, lifting his blade toward the stars, what few stars remained. "Then let him see me." The forest was silent once more. But it would not be for long. The deeper they journeyed into the cedar forest, the stranger the world became. The trees grew taller, their trunks twisted like ancient serpents, and the sky disappeared behind a canopy so dense that even starlight could not pierce through. Night had fallen hours ago, but here, it was darker than any night Gilgamesh had ever known. The forest itself seemed to exhale, a low, constant breath that stirred the leaves in unnatural patterns. Gilgamesh pressed forward, his torch flickering against unseen winds. Enkidu walked silently at his side, but every muscle in his body was alert. Though he had lived among beasts and trees, even he felt foreign in this place. The animals had vanished. There were no insects, no sounds of life, only the soft crunch of earth beneath their feet and the occasional groan of old wood bending under the weight of memory. Then it came, the breath louder now. Rhythmic. Measured. The sound of something colossal and alive, slumbering. Without speaking they both knew, Humbaba was near. The air thickened with each step. Gilgamesh's torchlight began to bend, as if reluctant to move forward. They pushed past walls of moss and curtains of vines until the path ended in a clearing, and there he stood. Humbaba. He did not speak at first. His form was massive, yet half shrouded in smoke and fire. His eyes glowed like coals in the dark. His skin looked carved from mountain stone, yet it moved with the ease of flesh. He stepped forward, and the earth trembled beneath him. "Who dares approach me?" His voice boomed, shaking branches and hearts alike. Gilgamesh stood firm. "I am Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. I seek your defeat to honor the gods and carve my name in legend." The guardian laughed, a terrible echoing sound that sounded like trees being uprooted. "Then come, little king," said Humbaba. "Come and meet the fury of the forest." With that, the battle began. Gilgamesh charged, sword flashing in firelight. Enkidu flanked to the side, wielding his axe with savage grace. But Humbaba was not merely strong, he was fast, unnaturally so. He swung fallen trees like clubs, struck the earth with fists that split stone, and breathed fire from his mouth with each roar. They fought for what felt like hours. The night above them churned with black clouds. Thunder rolled without lightning. Gilgamesh was thrown, landing hard against a boulder, blood trickling down his brow. Enkidu shouted, drawing Humbaba's wrath, buying time for the king to recover. At last Enkidu found a moment, a leap onto the monster's back, striking with all his might. Humbaba bellowed in rage and pain. Gilgamesh rose, lifting his sword high. "Now!" Enkidu cried. Gilgamesh drove his blade deep into Humbaba's chest. The giant fell to one knee. His flames dimmed. His voice cracked with something close to sorrow. "You do not know what you've done," he whispered. Gilgamesh hesitated. Humbaba no longer looked like a beast. He looked like a guardian. Ancient. Betrayed. "This forest, sacred," Humbaba gasped. "I was not your enemy. I was its voice." He lifted his face to the sky and cried out to the god Shamash. "See what your children have done. May they find only sorrow and victory." A darkness passed through the clearing then, not of shadow but of fate. With his last breath, Humbaba cursed them both. "Let your journey bring grief. Let one fall. Let the gods forget your names." And then, silence. The forest did not mourn. It simply accepted. Gilgamesh stood over the fallen titan. His chest heaved. His blade dripped. But his heart was strangely still. Enkidu approached, face pale. "We did what we came to do," said Gilgamesh. Enkidu looked into the forest. "But something has left this world. Something sacred." Overhead, thunder rumbled once more. And though no rain fell, both men felt it in their bones. The gods had heard. And they would not forget. They left the clearing with heavy silence clinging to their backs like wet cloth. The body of Humbaba lay behind them, still, smoking, strangely peaceful. Yet the forest no longer seemed alive. The air was still, suffocating, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Gilgamesh did not speak. Neither did Enkidu. The victory felt hollow. Yes, they had slain the guardian. But as they walked through the dying woods, every creaking branch and falling leaf sounded like a funeral dirge. The cedar forest, once sacred and proud, now felt stripped of its spirit, like a temple defiled. Hours passed. The stars, when they finally returned above the thinning canopy, blinked coldly from a distant sky. Then came the wind, dry, biting, unnatural. And with it, a whisper. Not a sound made by men or beasts, but something older. A voice that carried no breath. A feeling more than a sound. "You were seen." The sky split open. Thunder rumbled from a clear night sky, and lightning tore the heavens apart. A single bolt struck a nearby tree, splitting it in two, sending splinters into the darkness. The ground beneath Gilgamesh trembled. Enkidu fell to one knee, bracing against the earth. They had drawn the attention of the divine. From the clouds above descended not a form but a presence, a shimmer of gold and shadow, of wind and judgment. The god Enlil had come not as a figure but as fury incarnate. The trees bent away from his wrath. The stars dimmed. Even the wind halted, as if unwilling to be near him. A voice boomed from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You were warned." Gilgamesh dared to raise his head. "We sought glory, not disrespect." "You trespassed on holy ground," Enlil thundered. "You slew the appointed guardian of the gods. You have broken balance." Enkidu stood now, defiant. "We acted with strength, not malice. We faced danger, we did not cower." "And yet you have invited punishment," the voice said. "You, Enkidu, who once lived in harmony with nature, you will be the price." The words struck like a hammer to the soul. Gilgamesh stepped forward. "No. If blame must fall, let it fall on me." But Enlil's judgment was not swayed by pleas. "The fate is sealed." With that, the sky grew silent again. The wind returned, but now it was colder, sharper. The stars blinked back into place, but none of them looked friendly. The presence of the god faded, leaving only silence behind. Enkidu said nothing. But his face had changed. There was a shadow behind his eyes now. A tiredness not born of battle but of knowing. He placed a hand on Gilgamesh's shoulder. "It seems we have won the fight," he said quietly, "but not the war." The days that followed were strange. They journeyed back through the lands of men, cheered by villagers who saw only heroes. Songs were already being sung, of their courage, their conquest, their return. Gilgamesh smiled for them. But it never reached his eyes. Enkidu grew quieter. He would often stop mid-step, gazing into empty air as though hearing something far away. Animals avoided him. His skin began to pale. At night, he shivered, even under thick wool and beside roaring fires. And then one night, as they camped near the banks of the river Tigris, Enkidu spoke a dream. "I saw the halls of the dead," he said, eyes wide open though he was half asleep. "A great house of dust, where kings eat clay, where the light never enters, where the gods of death sit in judgment." Gilgamesh leaned close, heart pounding. Enkidu, wake. It was just a dream. But Enkidu turned to him, voice hollow. It was not a dream. It was a message. That night, Gilgamesh could not sleep. He sat watching the stars until they began to fade with dawn. He feared no monster of flesh, but fate, that unseen tyrant he could not fight. Soon after, Enkidu fell ill. No healer could explain it. His skin grew gray. His breath shallow. Birds would not sing near him. Even children cried at the sight of him. He laughed less. But not at all. One night, Gilgamesh sat beside him as he lay on a simple bed of reeds. I do not regret the battle, Enkidu said softly. But I regret leaving the wild. I was at peace there. You found more than the wild, Gilgamesh said. You found me. And I found you. Enkidu nodded slowly. Yes, I found friendship. And through it, the gods found reason to punish. He closed his eyes and for a long time said nothing. Then he whispered, Promise me, brother, live. Do not follow me into the dust. Gilgamesh took his hand. I will not let the gods have the last word. Enkidu smiled faintly. And then he was gone. Gilgamesh did not cry, not then. Not when he buried him beneath the oldest cedar tree, not when he sat alone for 3 days and nights without food or drink. But when he stood to leave, he looked up to the stars and said only, I will find you, Enkidu. In this world or the next. And thus began the second journey, not of conquest but of grief. The king of Uruk, once proud, now walked not for glory but for answers. He would challenge fate itself. Gilgamesh pressed on into the night, the stars above him flickering like ancient eyes watching his every move. The wind whispered through the stone canyons, speaking the names of those long forgotten. Each step carried the weight of 1,000 regrets, and still he walked. He was a king no longer but a seeker, driven not by glory but by grief. In the darkness, every shadow seemed to stretch toward him like a memory. Yet his eyes remained fixed on the horizon, the path toward Utnapishtim, the immortal. He did not know if such a man truly lived. He did not care. For what else was there but the hope, however faint, of reversing the cruelty of fate? Through barren wastes, across salt plains where no bird flew and no root took hold, he wandered. At night he rarely slept. When he did, Enkidu came to him, silent, stern, wrapped in moonlight, then fading before he could speak. The gods had taken his brother. Gilgamesh would defy them still. He found the twin-peaked mountain when the sky had turned to ash and the stars grew cold. Known in legend as Mashu, it was said to be the gate through which the sun passed at dawn and dusk. At its base loomed the scorpion men, beings carved by the gods themselves, part man, part beast, their eyes aglow with fire, their voices like the grinding of stone. One raised his claw and blocked Gilgamesh's path. Mortal, he intoned, why do you approach the gates of the sun? Gilgamesh stood tall, though weariness bent his bones. I seek Utnapishtim. Let me pass. The scorpion man's gaze pierced through him. None pass here but the sun itself. Beyond lies darkness deeper than the grave. None return. But Gilgamesh did not yield. He did not weep. He did not tremble. And so the guardians parted. Then walk in the path of the gods, said the scorpion man, but know this, even the stars turn pale in that darkness. He stepped into the tunnel. The light of the world vanished. For 12 leagues Gilgamesh groped through the void. Not even his own hands could be seen. He lost track of time, of space, of thought. There were no echoes in this place. Only the thrum of ancient power, the breath of the gods long gone. And then, light. A garden bloomed before him, unnatural and strange. Trees bore jewels instead of fruit. Rivers shimmered with liquid silver. A woman stood by a stone gate, her hair woven with vines that never withered. She was Siduri, keeper of the tavern at the edge of the world. She saw the dust on his cloak, the blood beneath his nails, the sorrow in his eyes. You are far from Uruk, traveler? I am Gilgamesh. And why do you disturb the rest of the gods? To find life that does not end. Siduri sighed, for she had heard this before. Many came. None returned. She served him drink. She offered him rest. But when morning came, if it was morning at all, he still sought passage. She told him of Urshanabi, the ferryman who crossed the waters of death. Gilgamesh went to him and in anger destroyed the sacred stones that once guided his boat. Still Urshanabi pitied him. If you would cross you must cut trees. Make oars with your own hands. One for each league. And so Gilgamesh did. His hands bled. His back ached. But he built what was needed. He rowed across the black waters, each stroke stealing strength from his soul. And when they reached the far shore there, at the edge of the world, stood a man older than kings with eyes like the sea before creation. Utnapishtim. He listened to Gilgamesh's tale. Of Enkidu. Of death. Of defiance. Then he said, "Why do you seek to live forever, Gilgamesh? The gods made men to die. The secret of life is not to run from death, but to live with meaning." But Gilgamesh could not accept that. So Utnapishtim told him a story. Of the flood. Of how the gods once sought to wipe clean the earth, and how he alone was spared, he and his wife, made immortal not by choice but by divine decree. "There is no gift without a price," Utnapishtim said. And yet he saw the fire in Gilgamesh and he offered a test. "Stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. Prove that your will defies even sleep." Gilgamesh accepted. He sat. He stared at the sea. And he slept. When he awoke, a week had passed. He wept. Not from weakness, but from truth. Even kings fall. Even heroes tire. Utnapishtim's wife, moved by his sorrow, whispered of a plant that grew beneath the waters. A plant that could restore youth. Gilgamesh dove. He found it. He held life in his hand. On the journey home he stopped to bathe in a clear pool. As he did, a serpent slipped from the reeds and swallowed the plant whole. The promise of immortality vanished. And Gilgamesh laughed. For the first time in many leagues he laughed. He returned to Uruk not as a god but as a man. And he carved his tale in stone. So that none would forget. That even in loss there is wisdom. Even in death there is life. Even in darkness there is light. The journey back to Uruk began under a moon the color of bleached bone. Gilgamesh walked alone along the ancient trade road, the Euphrates winding like a serpent through the blackened hills beside him. The air was thick with the scent of river mud and the ghost of rain. His pace was steady, his stride less the hungry march of a conqueror and more the thoughtful tread of a man returning from the edges of the world. He no longer carried the plant of eternal life. He no longer bore the fierce urgency that had driven him through deserts, over mountains and across the waters of death. What he carried now was heavier, though it weighed nothing in his hands. The knowledge that no wall, no sword, no prayer could keep mortality at bay. And yet strangely that weight felt clean. Each village he passed in the dark had shuttered windows and smoking hearths, but from time to time a dog would bark, a baby would cry, and the ordinary music of human life would drift into the night. He listened as if to a new language. By the second night, the mountains had receded into the horizon, and the flatlands opened before him. The road forked near a cluster of palm trees and there, beneath the moonlight, a group of shepherds spotted him from afar. They hesitated, uncertain if this gaunt, dust-covered figure was friend or foe. Gilgamesh did not wave nor call out. He simply kept walking. The youngest of the shepherds, perhaps no more than 12, stepped forward. His eyes widened as the torchlight caught the features of the stranger. "It is him," the boy whispered. "The king has returned." Word spread before Gilgamesh like wind before a storm. By the time he reached the last bend in the river, fishermen along the banks had abandoned their nets to run ahead and tell the city watch. He could see it now, the great walls of Uruk rising against the night sky, each brick a shadow upon shadow. The gates glowed faintly from the braziers hung above, the same gates he had left behind with such haste months before. He slowed his pace. For the first time in the long road home, he felt something like fear, not the fear of death but the fear of returning to a place that no longer fit the man he had become. The gates opened before he reached them. Torches flared along the battlements, casting restless light across the faces of soldiers and citizens alike. They stared in silence as he approached, parting like water before a prow. Gilgamesh stopped just inside the threshold and looked up at the walls. "I built these," he thought. "And still they will stand when my name is forgotten." The palace had not changed but he had. Its towering columns, its gold inlays, its lush gardens seemed at once familiar and alien, as if he were walking through the memory of another man. Servants bowed deeply as he passed, yet he noticed their eyes flicker with curiosity. Was their king the same as before, or had some other returned in his place? At the great hall the court was assembled. Nobles in robes of purple and bronze, priests with shaved heads and beaded necklaces, warriors in polished armor, all waited to hear the tales of their king. Gilgamesh spoke but not as he once had. Gone was the boast, the gleaming promise of conquest. He told them instead of the scorpion men at Mashu, of the tunnel beneath the mountains where light itself feared to tread, of Siduri's counsel, of the ferry across the waters of death, and of Utnapishtim's truth. He told them of the plant. He told them of the serpent. Some wept. Some shook their heads. A few smiled in that sad way reserved for those who finally understand the thing they most feared to know. When he finished, the hall was silent. Then an elder priest rose. "My king," he said, "you left to conquer death. You return with empty hands. What then have you brought us?" Gilgamesh looked out at the faces before him. "I have brought you this," he said. "The knowledge that our lives are brief, and that is why they matter. The gods have set a measure for us, and it is not in length but in what we build. Our walls, our laws, our children, our songs, these will be our immortality." The court murmured. The elder priest bowed his head. Weeks passed. The rhythm of the city's life reclaimed him, yet it no longer bound him. He walked among the workers rebuilding a collapsed section of the city wall. He sat beside scribes in the archives recording not just decrees but stories, his own and others. He spoke with traders in the market, learning of lands beyond even his reach. At night, when the city was quiet, he would climb to the top of the western wall. There, alone beneath the vault of stars, he would gaze at the Euphrates and feel the pulse of the world moving through it. Sometimes he imagined Enkidu standing beside him, wild hair lifted by the wind, silent but not absent. And always he thought of the serpent, not with bitterness but with a strange respect. The plant had returned to the earth. Perhaps it was meant to. One evening the council gathered in secret. A neighboring city-state had sent emissaries with threats disguised as trade offers. In the past, Gilgamesh would have summoned his generals and marched at dawn. This time he listened. He weighed the words. He imagined the cost in lives. And then, to the surprise of his war captains, he ordered a different path, an alliance through shared labor, the construction of a great canal that would bind the two cities in mutual need. There were murmurs of weakness. But within months the work began, and the threat dissolved into cooperation. The people began to speak of their king in new terms, not as the lion who roared for war, but as the oak whose roots held the riverbank firm. On the last night of the harvest festival, the city gathered in the grand plaza. Musicians played beneath the torchlight, dancers in bright linen spun in wide circles, children raced between tables piled high with bread, fruit, and roasted lamb. Gilgamesh stood at the edge of the crowd, cloaked in simple wool. He did not join the feasting, but he watched, and for the first time since Enkidu's death, the sight brought him peace. A young boy, not much older than the shepherd he had met on the road, approached. "Are you the king?" he asked. Gilgamesh smiled faintly. "I am Gilgamesh. Is it true you went to the edge of the world?" "Yes." "And what did you find there?" Gilgamesh knelt so that his eyes met the boy's. "I found that the edge of the world is not far away. It is here in each of us in the days we are given. And it is enough." The boy frowned as if trying to carry the weight of the words. Then he nodded and ran back to the laughter of the crowd. Gilgamesh turned his gaze upward. The moon hung low, and the stars seemed brighter than he had ever known them. Uruk slept. The king remained awake. The first sign came with the river. It was early autumn when fishermen along the southern bends of the Euphrates began pulling up nets heavy with dead fish. The water, once clear in the moonlight, now shimmered with an oily sheen. At first, people whispered of foul tides and distant storms. But when the livestock along the riverbanks began falling ill, the whispers grew sharper. One night, a messenger from the southern watchtower arrived breathless at the palace gates. His eyes were red from dust and sleeplessness. "My king," he gasped, "there are fires on the far bank, dozens maybe more. They do not belong to us." Gilgamesh sent for the captain of the guard. Together they climbed the eastern wall, the one that faced the long bend where the river curved away toward rival lands. The moon was high, silvering the surface of the water. And there, on the far shore, torches burned like a necklace of embers. No banners flew. No drums sounded. Yet the torches remained unmoving. "They watch us," the captain murmured. Gilgamesh said nothing. His eyes tracked the pattern of the lights, the way they shifted ever so slightly with the wind. It was not the stance of an army preparing to charge. It was the patience of one waiting for something. The council convened at night. Priests, generals, and merchants filled the great hall, their voices a tangle of alarm and speculation. Some urged immediate attack, others argued for sending envoys. The southern merchants were the loudest, fearing their river trade would wither under siege. Gilgamesh listened as they spoke over one another. Then he raised his hand and the hall fell silent. 2 seasons ago, he said, we turned an enemy into an ally with the canal project. But this, he gestured toward the south, is not the same. They are not here for trade. They poison the river to test our will. And if we wait, asked one general, then they will grow bold enough to cross. A murmur ran through the room. "But I will not throw men into darkness without knowing the shape of the threat," Gilgamesh continued. "I will go myself to see them." Gasps rose like birds startled from the rafters. That night, he left the city with only 3 companions: the captain of the guard, a scout from the river settlements, and a young scribe to record what they found. They moved quietly, following the moonlit bank, their sandals muffled by reeds and damp soil. The air thickened with the scent of rot as they neared the fires. From behind a screen of tamarisk trees, Gilgamesh saw them clearly at last, rows of tents pitched close to the water, each with its own guarded torch. But it was not the tents that caught his attention. It was the figures moving between them, tall, cloaked shapes whose faces were covered in dark veils. They carried long jars, which they poured into the river with slow, deliberate care. "What is in the jars?" whispered the scribe. Gilgamesh's gaze narrowed. "Poison," he said. "And perhaps something worse." He did not know the substance, but the smell was acrid, stinging the nose even from across the bank. It was heavier than oil, sinking into the current instead of riding its surface. When they returned to Uruk before dawn, Gilgamesh summoned the palace's oldest healer, a woman named Ninsudu whose hair was white as moonlit sand. She examined the fish brought back from the poisoned bend, then mixed powders and herbs by torchlight. "This is no natural thing," she said at last. "It is brewed from bitter roots and ground minerals, meant to kill quietly over time. It will sicken animals first, then people." "How long before it reaches Uruk?" Gilgamesh asked. "Days," she replied. "If the poisoners do not stop, it will reach us faster." By nightfall, Gilgamesh had made his choice. They would not wait for the river to deliver sickness to their gates. But neither would they march in open war. Instead, he ordered a covert strike, a small force to cross the river under the cover of darkness and destroy the jars before they could be poured. The plan was dangerous. It relied on speed, surprise, and silence. The river's currents were treacherous at night, and the poisoners would surely guard their supply closely. Yet when Gilgamesh asked for volunteers, more came forward than he could take. Many of them were young, too young, he thought, to know how much of themselves they might lose in the shadows. But he could not deny their courage. On the 3rd night they set out. The moon was thin, a silver sliver barely lighting the water. Gilgamesh led the crossing, his hands gripping the sides of the reed boat as the current tugged them southward. The only sounds were the dip of oars and the whisper of the wind through the river grass. When they reached the far bank, the men moved like smoke between the trees. The smell of the poison was stronger now, a metallic bitterness that clung to the back of the throat. The first guard they encountered was a tall figure with a veil and a curved blade. Gilgamesh struck quickly, pulling him into the shadows before he could cry out. The man's body went limp, the blade clattering softly into the reeds. They found the jars in neat rows near the largest tent, their narrow necks sealed with wax. "Smash them all," Gilgamesh ordered. The men set to work, breaking each jar and spilling its contents into pits they had dug in the sand, far from the water. But they had destroyed only half when the alarm came, a cry in a harsh tongue followed by the pounding of feet. Torches flared. Shadows leapt across the tents. The poisoners swarmed from every side. The fight was swift and brutal. Gilgamesh moved like a storm, his blade catching the moonlight as it cut through veils and cloth. The captain fought back to back with him, the scout darting between enemies like a jackal. When the last of the poisoners fled into the night, the ground was littered with broken jars and bodies. Gilgamesh stood in the torchlight, chest heaving, his hands slick with blood, not all of it his own. The river flowed quietly beside them, carrying away the traces of the fight. They had stopped the poisoning, but Gilgamesh knew this was not the end. Whoever had sent these men would not give up so easily. The shadows over the river would return. When they came back to Uruk at dawn, the people gathered to greet them. Some cheered, but others looked upon the blood on their king's tunic and grew silent. Gilgamesh walked past them without speaking, his mind already turning to the next threat. That night, alone atop the wall, he looked south. No fires burned there now, but he imagined he could still see them, flickering at the edge of the horizon. The lesson of Utnapishtim had not left him. Life was short. But some nights, it seemed, were made for fighting to keep it. The first arrows came not at dawn, but in the middle of the night. They hissed through the darkness like serpents, embedding themselves in the wooden gates with a deep, resonant thud. The watchman's horns blared, and Gilgamesh was awake before the second blast. He pulled on his armor without ceremony, the bronze plates cold against his skin. By the time he reached the wall, the air was already thick with the scent of burning pitch. The southern bank of the river was no longer a place of scattered torches. It was a wall of flame. Hundreds of firepots burned in neat lines, casting the silhouettes of an army onto the shifting orange light. And between those flames, Gilgamesh saw them, the veiled warriors from the poisoned river, now in numbers too great to count. The captain of the guard approached, blood already streaking his cheek from a glancing arrow. "They've crossed at 3 points," he said grimly. "Our men are holding the eastern ford, but the western bank may already be lost." Gilgamesh's gaze traveled along the wall to where shadows moved fast against the dim light, too fast for retreat, too many for a scouting party. "They're testing us again," the king murmured, "but this time they mean to stay." The council at midnight. The inner hall was lit by a dozen oil lamps, their flames swaying as the outer gates shook under distant impacts. Priests whispered prayers while generals argued over whether to concentrate forces at the eastern or western ford. "They want us to split our strength," Gilgamesh said. "If we scatter, they will push through both crossings. We must make them commit to one." "And how, my king, do you suggest we persuade them to choose?" asked an elder merchant, his voice sharp with fear. "By making them believe the other is weak," Gilgamesh replied. It was a dangerous gamble, one that would require false retreats and deliberate exposure. The generals exchanged uneasy glances, but none offered a better plan. The feigned weakness. The orders were given quickly. At the western ford, Gilgamesh ordered the gates to remain open just enough to be seen from the river. Patrols along the wall there were thinned, torches dimmed until the battlements seemed nearly abandoned. Meanwhile, under the cover of deep night, the bulk of Uruk's defenders moved east, their armor muffled with strips of cloth. Archers took positions in shadowed towers, each man instructed to hold his shot until the king's signal. From the high wall, Gilgamesh watched the enemy's movement. Sure enough, like moths to an unguarded flame, their forces began to shift westward, crossing the shallows in growing numbers. But Gilgamesh was not at the eastern ford to command the ambush. He was on horseback, riding hard through the city's narrow streets toward the west. The clash at the ford. By the time he reached the western bank, enemy warriors had already poured halfway into the city's outer district. Torches blazed in the hands of both sides, but the greater light came from the burning of storage huts and market stalls. Gilgamesh rode straight into the fray, his blade catching the firelight as he cut down the first man in his path. The sound was a storm, steel on steel, shouts and screams, the pounding of feet on cobblestones. Then came the signal. A sharp, rising note from a horn at the eastern ford. In the same breath, archers hidden along the rooftops of the western district rose and unleashed their arrows. The enemy's front ranks staggered, their advance broken. From the riverbank, Uruk's hidden reserve charged, slamming into the enemy's flank. The narrow streets funneled the invaders into killing lanes where Gilgamesh and his men struck without mercy. The turning of the tide. By midnight's end, the western ford was secure. The enemy was driven back into the river, their torches bobbing and vanishing in the current. But Gilgamesh did not call the battle won. From the high tower above the gates, he could still see the distant fires on the far bank. They burned steady, like stars that refused to fade. "These were not all their forces," the captain said beside him. "No," Gilgamesh agreed. "The real strike will come when they think we are sleeping." The iron sky. It came in the hour before dawn. A roar like thunder rolled over the city, not from the sky but from the river itself. The enemy had lashed together dozens of flat-bottomed boats, each carrying a siege tower of blackened wood. The towers moved forward under the steady beat of war drums, their shapes lit from beneath by firepots, casting monstrous shadows against the clouds. Gilgamesh felt the air grow heavy, as if the night itself were bracing for the impact. "Archers to the walls," he bellowed. "Pour oil when they're close enough to smell it." The first tower struck the western wall with the groan of splintering wood. Hooks and ladders rose, and veiled warriors surged upward into the rain of arrows and boiling oil. Gilgamesh fought among them, his sword an arc of bronze fury, his voice carrying above the chaos like a war drum. The final push. When the eastern gates began to buckle, Gilgamesh made his choice. He left the western wall in the hands of his captain and led a counterstrike east, cutting through alleys and burning barricades to reach the gates just as they gave way. The fighting there was closer, dirtier, daggers and short spears in the press of bodies, blood slick on the stones. Gilgamesh took a cut to the shoulder but did not slow, driving forward until the gatehouse was cleared and the enemy forced back across the ford. By the time the sun's first light touched the walls of Uruk, the river was choked with the wreckage of siege towers and the bodies of those who had tried to breach them. Aftermath. The people of Uruk celebrated in the streets, but Gilgamesh walked the walls in silence. The fires on the far bank were gone, but he knew they had not burned themselves out. He also knew something else, that the city had stood not because of walls or weapons, but because they had fought as one. The poisoned river, the night raids, the siege, all had been trials to strip away their fear. And in that the enemy had failed. The victory feast was loud, but Gilgamesh did not join. He stood in the cool quiet of the palace balcony, the voices of Uruk rising faintly from the streets below. The city was alive, and yet something in him could not rest. For every enemy who had fallen at the walls, two questions had risen in their place. Who sent them? And why now? The survivor. At dawn, the guards brought him the only prisoner taken alive, a young warrior with the veil torn from his face, his cheek marred by a burn from boiling oil. The man was silent at first, his eyes defiant. But Gilgamesh knew how to strip away defiance. He offered water, then wine, then a promise. Tell me who leads you, and you will live to see the next moon. The answer was not what he expected. They call him the voice beyond the dunes, the man said, his words trembling. We never saw his face. Orders came by messenger, but they came with gold. Enough for a man to risk the god's wrath. Gold. The word clung in Gilgamesh's mind. This was not war for faith or revenge. This was purchased. The Council of Shadows. That night, in the high chamber lit only by a single brazier, Gilgamesh summoned his closest circle, and Mejoranki the seer, Shiduri the tavern keeper who heard whispers from travelers, and Ninsun, his mother, whose wisdom was feared even by priests. Their leader is a phantom, Gilgamesh said. But gold does not come from phantoms. Somewhere, someone paid for this siege. Shiduri spoke first. Merchants talk when they drink. I have heard of caravans from the north carrying not goods but sealed chests. They bypassed Uruk entirely, heading east. Ninsun's eyes narrowed. East leads to Kish, and Kish's throne has long envied our walls. The seer's voice was low, almost drowned by the brazier's crackle. If it is Kish, then the siege was not to take Uruk but to measure its heart. They will strike again, when your people believe the danger is gone. The road of ash. Gilgamesh decided he would not wait for the next strike. He would find the source himself. Under the cover of night, he left Uruk with a small band, men sworn to him not as king but as brothers. They rode east through the silent plains where the grass still smelled of smoke from burned farms. By the second night, the road turned to gravel and ash. Here they found the remains of an abandoned encampment, charcoal pits, broken spear hafts, and in the dirt, the mark of a foreign seal pressed into clay. It was not the mark of Kish, the city of whispers. Following the trail took them to Akshak, a city that thrived on secrets. Its streets were narrow and steep, and its market stayed open long past sunset, lit by paper lanterns swaying in the warm night wind. In a tavern thick with incense smoke, Gilgamesh heard the first whisper of the truth. They call him the Masked One, a spice trader murmured, his eyes darting. Not a king, not a priest, a broker of war. He sells armies like others sell grain. If your enemy has gold, he has soldiers. And where does he take this gold? Gilgamesh asked. The man hesitated. To the black tents beyond the desert. But none who follow that road return. The assassin in the night. They left the tavern at midnight, but did not make it to their horses before the first blade flashed. The assassin moved like liquid shadow, striking for Gilgamesh's throat. Bronze met steel in the lamplight, the clash echoing down the alley. Gilgamesh's men cut off his retreat, but the killer fought with the desperation of one who knows capture means worse than death. When the man finally lay still, they found nothing on him. No coin, no token, except a scrap of silk embroidered with the same foreign seal they had found in the burned camp. The decision. Back in Uruk, Gilgamesh stood in the great hall, the silk scrap in his hand. His people saw only the victory at the walls. They did not see the shadow growing beyond the desert, the faceless broker who could turn any city into an army overnight. He looked to the horizon where night swallowed the dunes. If he sells war, Gilgamesh said quietly, then I will buy the truth. And when I find him, I will end his trade forever. The wind in the black desert carried no scent, no dust, no spice, no trace of life. It was as if the land itself had been burned clean by the gods and left to sleep under an endless vault of stars. Gilgamesh's horses' hooves crunched over brittle ground that once might have been river clay, now cracked and lifeless. His men followed silently, each wrapped in heavy cloaks against the night's sharp cold. For 3 days they had ridden east from Akshak, following whispers, bribes, and tracks in the sand so faint they seemed to vanish the moment they were found. But now the desert itself felt wrong. The stars above wheeled in patterns Gilgamesh did not know. Sometimes when the wind rose he thought he heard voices, not words, just the shape of them like shadows and sound. The seer and Mejoranki rode at his side, his hood low over his eyes. "This is a cursed land," the old man murmured. "The ancients say the gods struck it down for a king who dared by the thrones of his neighbors. Perhaps it is fitting we ride here now." Gilgamesh said nothing. He could feel the weight of the silk scrap in his pouch, the foreign seal embroidered into it as though burned into his palm. He was not chasing glory. He was hunting an ending. The camp of black tents. On the fourth night they saw it. A cluster of black tents stood against the horizon like holes torn in the world. No torches burned outside, yet the camp glimmered faintly, as if lit from within by a color that was not fire. The air here was heavy, warmer than the desert wind, and it smelled faintly of iron. Gilgamesh raised a hand and his men halted. "Only I go forward," he said. "The masked one deals in shadows. Too many blades will scare him into vanishing." And Mejoranki frowned. "And if he kills you? Then you will know his face," Gilgamesh said, "and you will finish what I could not." He left his horse at the edge of the dunes and walked into the camp. The masked one. The largest tent was open at the front, its flaps stirring in the wind. Inside, the light was dim, but the air shimmered as though heat rose from the ground. At the center sat a man in a chair carved from black wood. His robe was deep crimson, his mask smooth and white, featureless except for the mouth slit. "You have come far, King of Uruk," the masked one said, his voice calm, neither young nor old. "Few make it to my door." Gilgamesh stepped forward. "You sent armies to my gates. You poisoned my river. Why?" The masked one tilted his head slightly. "Because someone paid me to." "That is the truth you seek, is it not?" Gilgamesh's jaw tightened. "Who?" The masked one leaned back. "A king to your north, one who fears Uruk's power. But you misunderstand me, I am no enemy of yours. I am a seller of possibilities. For the right price, I could sell you an army to burn his walls in return." The offer hung in the air like smoke. "You sell death," Gilgamesh said. "And you think it matters who buys it." "It matters to me only that the coin is pure," the masked one replied. The battle in the tent. The sword was in Gilgamesh's hand before the masked one could finish speaking. The man moved faster than he should have, parrying with a dagger pulled from his sleeve, rising from the chair in a blur. The braziers light through their shadows against the tent walls, steel flashing with every clash. Outside, Gilgamesh's men heard nothing. The fight was silent save for the sharp ring of metal and the hiss of the sand when a blade struck low. When the masked one's dagger finally fell, Gilgamesh drove him to his knees. With one hand he ripped the mask away. The face beneath was unremarkable, middle-aged, a faint scar along the jaw, eyes steady and cold. Not a king. Not a priest. Just a man. "This is who you feared," the masked one said, blood on his teeth. "A man who knows what war is worth." Gilgamesh drove his blade through the man's heart. The price of the truth. When the masked one fell, the light inside the tent guttered. The air went cold. And then the voices in the wind grew louder, not whispers now, but the low chant of many tongues, coming from beyond the walls of the world. The seer burst into the tent. "You fool," and Mejoranki said. "He was bound to something older than kings. Killing him breaks the pact." "What pact?" "The one that kept the black desert sleeping." Outside, the dunes began to shift, rising like waves. Figures crawled from the sand, shapes not entirely human, their eyes glowing with the same color that had lit the camp. Gilgamesh knew what this meant. If the masked one's death had unleashed them, they would not stop at the desert. They would cross into the lands of men. The final choice. They fought through the night, blades ringing in the dark. But there were too many. For every shadow they cut down, two more rose from the sand. The seer shouted over the din, "There is one way to bind them again. A king's blood, spilled willingly in the desert's heart." Gilgamesh looked to the east, where the faintest hint of dawn touched the horizon. Uruk would survive if he stayed. But if he left, if he rode now, the shadows would follow. He drove his sword into the sand, the blade standing upright. "Tell them," he said to Mejoranki, "that their king kept the walls strong." And then he walked into the rising tide of shadows. Epilogue. Weeks later, a lone rider returned to Uruk. It was Mejoranki. In the great hall, he laid Gilgamesh's crown on the stone floor before Nin's son. "He gave them peace," the seer said quietly. "But not himself." That night, the people of Uruk lit torches along the walls, their flames a line of gold against the dark. And somewhere, far in the black desert, the wind carried the sound of footsteps, steady, unending, as if their king still walked the dunes.